Hi. I want to talk about something that I think we don't talk enough about in the information security community. We often talk a lot about technology. How do we stop hacking attacks? What are the latest attack trends out there? But we never really talk about what incentivizes people to do these things, or what incentivizes companies to have good security, and what incentivizes criminals to hack into things. So that's what I want to talk about, because I feel like historically we've kind of seen information security as more of a human versus machine issue, as in you're trying to defend your systems from being attacked from a machine perspective because the machine is attacking it. But actually, I think we need to look at cybersecurity as a human versus human issue. If you get compromised, it's because there's a human at the other end doing that hacking. So that's why I think incentives matter. You have to understand the human incentives when these things happen. Because if you go to any trade show like this one, for example, you go to the cybersecurity vendors, you ask them what do you need if you want to protect yourself. They'll give you the same story that they've always given you for the past 20 years. Get a firewall, IDS, IPS, etc. Get all of these technologies that you have to install on your systems to make your problems go away. But that's what we've been saying for the past 20 years. So I think clearly that's not working. We have plenty of technology. We have so much technology, and we have so much knowledge on how to stop these hacking attacks. But why are we still being compromised by the same old ways that were being compromised 20 years ago? 20 years ago, we used to be worried about things like Flash exploits or Java exploits or people clicking random links or simple things like SQL injection. But companies are still being compromised the same way 20 years later. Why isn't it changing? Why are people still being compromised through weak passwords or password reuse? So I think clearly the things that we're doing aren't working, and we have to start thinking more deeply about these issues and have to understand the human motivations of why these things happen. And I think I have a somewhat of a unique perspective of that because, as was said, when I was on the other side of the security industry. I was an actual hacker doing hacking on the black hat side. And so, for example, one of the companies that we hacked was Sony. This was in 2011, and Sony, there was this big PlayStation Network hack that many of you may have heard of, where 80 million user accounts were compromised. And during the 2 month period of June and July of 2011, Sony was actually hacked 21 times in that 2 month period. 21 times in 2 months. Why did Sony get hacked so many times in 2 months? Because they had so many vulnerable applications on their systems that hackers would consider hacking Sony like the game of the year. It's like let's see who can hack Sony the most. And so like hackers would challenge each other to see, oh, I can hack Sony more than you, because Sony was just so easy to hack because they didn't really care about cybersecurity. The funny thing about Sony is that they actually had a cybersecurity team, and just before that big PlayStation Network hack happened, they fired the entire security team, and all of these attacks happened. So this is often the case in large organizations. They have a security team, but they often don't let them they get in the way of their work, because sometimes what they want to do is seen as an overhead. It's like security is often seen as an overhead cost in these organizations, not as like something that inherently adds value to the business. So if we look at 4 different kind of players that you might consider in the cybersecurity field, there's companies, there's criminals, there's customers who are customers of those companies, and there's governments. And you might think it's pretty obvious what their incentives are. Companies, customers, and governments all want to defeat criminals. But actually, I think it couldn't be further than the truth. I think in many business models that we see, the incentive of customers and companies and governments are very different. So if you look at the purpose of a company, the purpose of a company is obviously to make a profit. Assuming you're a for-profit company, you want to satisfy your shareholders and you want to sell products. And I would argue that's inherently incompatible with investing in cybersecurity. So if you look at, for example, Yahoo, I'm sure many of you have heard this week, Yahoo just revealed that 3 billion user accounts were compromised in 2013 or 2014. And we're hearing about this today. Why is Yahoo telling us that 3 billion user accounts were compromised 3 years later? So Yahoo also has a pretty big security team. And in 2014, the security team discovered that they were hacked, they were breached, and billions and billions of user accounts were compromised. But instead of telling the customers immediately that they were compromised, because it's the right thing to do, if your data gets breached, then you should inform your customers. Instead of doing that, the CEO of the company decided to veto the decision of the security team and tell them not to tell customers. And the reason why she didn't want to tell customers that they were breached is because obviously that's a reputational damage to Yahoo that would cause them to be less competitive in the field that they are in. People might switch to Gmail, for example. So we're in this kind of situation where there is no incentive for companies to do the right thing and inform customers that they've been breached. And so if there is no incentive for companies to inform customers that they've been breached, then why should companies invest in cybersecurity? Because at the end of the day, if Yahoo gets compromised, it's not Yahoo that has a problem here. It's not Yahoo that is losing. It's the customers of Yahoo that are losing. Yahoo doesn't care as long as the customers continue paying them for their services. And that's the same with any other company, like Sony, for example. Why should a company care about its cybersecurity if its customers will never find out if they've been breached? So you might as well just have poor security and get breached every day. But if your customers don't know about it, they're still going to pay you. So why should you do the right thing? And that's a genuine problem that we have. A lot of companies don't expose that they've been breached. For all of the breaches that we hear about in the news today, that's probably just the surface of all the breaches that are actually happening. There's probably so much more breaches that are happening that we've never heard about, because the companies don't want to disclose these breaches. Customers are obviously going to have a good, get a good deal with the value that they're buying, or the product that they're using, whether it be free or paid for. And most customers are obviously not technologically savvy, so they can't just look at a product and see and tell if it's secure or not. Like, they can't just look at Yahoo or Google and say, oh, I can tell this website is secure. So there is no easy way for customers to kind of operate in this kind of like free market of I will pick the most secure service, because they don't know who's secure. They're just going to pick the cheapest service. And this is specifically a problem with the Internet of Things, because if you go on Amazon and you type in a Bluetooth light bulb or something, or a Wi-Fi fridge, which product are you going to buy? You're probably going to buy the one that has the most fanciest features and has the best price and looks the coolest. But you have no way to tell how secure that product is just by looking at it. And so why should companies producing these devices actually care to invest in making their products secure if customers can't even tell if they're secure or not, and they're going to buy the products anyway? And this is a problem, because we might end up in a situation where we have a smart home where we have all of these smart devices, and your fridge might have ransomware on it that asking you to pay Bitcoin, or you can't eat your food. And that's the reality that we might end up in. Criminals, they have lots of different ways to monetize information that they have collected from data breaches. So obviously, criminals have there's lots of different incentives. But if we're talking about specifically financial criminals, if they breached a company, typically what they would do is they would try to maximize how much money they can get from that data breach. That might, for example, involve identity theft or credit card fraud or things like that, or they might sell the data on the dark web. But again, the criminals also don't want customers to know that the data they have stolen has been stolen. So customers, so the criminals and companies are both have aligned incentive on that perspective, that they both want to keep breaches away from the public, even though it's the wrong thing to do on behalf of a company. It's the most financially it's the most financially efficient thing to do, because you don't want to lose customers, but it's not the morally right thing to do. So we've ended up in we've ended up in a situation where there is very little incentive for a company to do the right thing financially. And I think that's what we have to think about if we really want to fix the cybersecurity issues that we've been seeing in the industry. So when I was doing when I was in the hacking group that I was in, LulzSec, in 2011, I was 16. This was in the summer of 2011. And during that 50-day period, we would just hack any kind of large organizations that we could find vulnerabilities in. And sometimes we would, for example, email those organizations to tell them that they have a vulnerability in their systems. But in most cases, they wouldn't care, because they just ignore the emails. They only seem to start to care about cybersecurity once they've actually been breached, and then when it becomes a PR disaster for them. So that's what we did. We made it a PR disaster for them. So Sony, for example, they only really started caring about cybersecurity when they were hacked 21 times in June and July of 2011. Before then, they just saw it as an overhead cost. And I think, unfortunately, that's what we're going to see with the vast majority of organizations today. They only start really thinking about cybersecurity once they've actually been breached. Because before then, the board level doesn't really see the risks until they actually materialize. And it kind of makes sense to an extent, because for most companies aren't technology companies. Most companies are technology-enabled companies, which means that they use technology to enhance their business. So security isn't like a core feature of a core product offering that adds value to their product. So security is like something that you should be doing anyway. And in some cases, companies have to worry about security for regulatory reasons. They have to check a box because there's some ISO standard there. But that's still problematic, because to check that box, they hire some pen testing company, whether it be KPMG or NCC Group or whatever, and they often have these companies bid on the lowest possible on a contract to do a pen testing contract on the systems. And usually they pick the lowest price contract because they just want to check the box. They don't actually care whether the systems are actually secure. They simply care about checking that box to say that they've met the regulations. But again, that's not what we want, because if you just check that box, sure, it will make you slightly more secure. But for most organizations, that only makes you very slightly more secure. You're still going to have a lot of issues, and you're still going to be easily hackable if you just check that box. And we've seen this, for example, there was a certificate authority in China, I think, that was I think it was called StartCom, and this is a certificate authority that essentially you can get an SSL certificate from them, and if you want to get your certificate authority included in a major browser like Firefox or Chrome, then you have to spend at least something like $100,000 on security testing on your certificate authority to make sure that it can't easily be hacked and produce rogue certificates. So this company hired KPMG Hong Kong to do this testing, and this company was still compromised by some hacker, and the authorities start producing rogue certificates. And so Firefox did an investigation to that, and they found that KPMG Hong Kong, their security testing was so basic that they actually blacklisted them in the future for future pen testing for future certificate authorities. And that's a major issue, because if you can't trust a major organization like KPMG to do your security testing, then who can you trust? And I have friends, for example, who have their own security consultancies, but they charge a lot more than the big consultancies like KPMG, but they also provide much more in-depth testing, but they don't get a lot of customers because most companies only care about meeting the minimum requirements to just tell their regulators that, oh yeah, we've checked the checkbox, so we're meeting the regulations. Um, so you would think that governments have an invested interest in making sure that companies are hard to breach. But sometimes that couldn't be further from the truth, because so in the UK we have an interesting situation. In the UK we have an intelligence agency called GCHQ, which stands for the Government Communications Headquarters, and that's like the UK's version of the NSA, which is the National Security Agency. So GCHQ is a organization in the UK that essentially its job is to find exploits in software that everyone uses, like Chrome or Firefox, and use those exploits to hack people in foreign countries to gather intelligence about whatever that might be, whether it be foreign intelligence about Russia or China or whatever. And they also do internet surveillance. So we've got a situation where governments are actively finding and holding exploits in software that we all use on a daily basis to exploit people. And GCHQ has a recently launched subsidiary called the National Cybersecurity Center. And the job of the National Cybersecurity Center is to fix exploits that are reported to them and advise companies on how to have good security posture and so on. But there's a major conflict of interest there, because the interest of the National Cybersecurity Center is to fix exploits, but the interest of the GCHQ is to hoard exploits. So how do you reconcile that conflict of interest? How can you trust your own government to give you security advice if you know that government is hoarding exploits that they can use to hack you? And that's the situation that we have today in the UK. So we know already that, for example, the UK government uses these exploits against Chinese companies for economic espionage purposes. But there's lots of Chinese companies that are based in the UK, Chinese technology companies that are based in the UK. So if you're a Chinese technology company based in the UK, you can't even trust your own government to give you security advice because they're actively exploiting you. And that's a really messed up situation that we have. And that's a perfect example of that is the WannaCry ransomware. And the WannaCry ransomware was using an exploit that was developed by the National Security Agency in the US. So the National Security Agency in the US, they developed an exploit that could be used to pretty much hack any Windows machine, from Windows 95 to Windows 98 to Windows 10. So any Windows machine that has existed within a 15-year period, they have an exploit to hack it. And they've been sitting on this exploit for 15 years without telling anyone about it. And then last year, it was leaked to the public by some unknown hacker group called the Shadow Brokers. And then Microsoft patched it. But of course, most companies don't bother patching their systems because it's too much of an inconvenience for them. So even though Microsoft released a patch, someone decided to put this exploit in a piece of ransomware called WannaCry. And they launched this ransomware. It was a very poorly designed ransomware, but it worked. And the next day, it infected billions of computers. And it infected the entire NHS, which is the National Health Service in the UK. And so lots of hospitals in the UK had to stop serving patients, and they couldn't serve patients or take any patients, and doctors couldn't see patients, all because of this ransomware that affected their computer systems using an exploit developed by the US government. How have you ended up in a situation where the US government is causing massive mayhem on hospitals using an exploit that was leaked for them, by them? There's obviously a massive problem there. And the NSA is a close partner of the GCHQ in London. So I think they should be pretty upset about that. But this isn't the only exploit that they hoard. They also will hoard exploits for Cisco firewalls and Cisco VPNs. If you have a Cisco firewall, the NSA probably has an exploit for that. It was just leaked last year that the NSA had an exploit to get the private keys for Cisco VPNs from anywhere between 2003 to 2017, actually. So if you had a Cisco firewall between 2003 to 2017, then the NSA has an exploit for that, and they could have potentially hacked you with that. And you might think that you're not a target. It's the NSA. I'm probably not a target here. But the NSA routinely exploits companies all the time, not because they might be terrorists or pedophiles, but because they might have information that they might be interested in. So, for example, it was recently revealed that the NSA hacked into a whole bunch of to this company. They hacked into this company. I forgot what it was called, but the company was basically provided anti-money laundering services to banks all over the world. This was an anti-money laundering company that the NSA hacked into. Why would the NSA hack into a money laundering company? Not because the anti-money laundering company was doing evil things, but because the anti-money laundering company had access to a lot of information that the NSA had access to. So even if you think you're not a target, you probably are. And GCHQ, for example, they hacked into. So in Belgium, there's this factory that produces like pretty much a large portion of all the SIM cards in Europe that we have in our phones. So if you have a SIM card, then this SIM card was probably produced by a factory in somewhere in Belgium. And it was recently revealed that GCHQ had hacked into this factory for many years, and they stole the encryption keys that they used to generate those SIM cards. So if you have a SIM card, then the keys that were used to generate that are probably compromised by GCHQ. So everything is basically compromised by either the NSA or GCHQ. And you might think you're not a target, but if you have information, if you're a telecom or if you're a company that provides services to a lot of other companies, you probably are a target. If you're a sysadmin, you're probably a target. GCHQ was routinely compromising sysadmins that used to work for a Belgian company called Belgacom, not because those sysadmins were terrorists, but because they had access to systems that GCHQ wanted access to. And is that something that we're really comfortable with? So there's no easy solution to this, but to obviously lobby the government to try and change their habits, because we can't have a situation where all of the infrastructure that we use is basically a fair game for the intelligence agencies of the UK and the US. Like it's not really acceptable anymore. Like you can't tell your customers straight to their face that we offer you a secure product. We offer you a secure solution, and our product is secure, but you know it's not secure because some intelligence agency probably has some exploit for it. And to be honest, there's probably nothing you can do about it, because they have so much more resources than we do, and then your security team, and they can easily find new zero-day exploits for anything that you can think of. So I guess the question is, how do we create desirable incentives? Like, how do we actually incentivize companies to do the right thing? If companies have no incentive to actually tell customers or inform customers that they have been breached, then how do we encourage them to do that? And I think, personally, I think that we should require all companies by law to disclose when they've been breached. If you've been breached, you should be required by law to disclose that. And I'm kind of surprised that's not the case already in many countries. In the UK, that might be the case soon with the GDPR, but in many countries, it's still not the case. Because I think the key thing that we have to worry about is trying to shed transparency on the security practices of companies, so that customers can make an informed choice about whether they use your service or not. If customers can make an informed choice about how secure your product is, then maybe the company will be more incentivized to actually invest in their cybersecurity. If you don't, because if you don't invest in your cybersecurity and you're required by law to disclose that you've been breached, and then your customers can see that, or future customers can see, oh, I'm not going to go with this company because they've been breached so many times in the past few months or past few years. We're going to go with a different company. Then I think companies will care more about that, because that's the sad reality of the situation that we live in. Maybe I'm a bit too pessimistic about this, but I honestly think that most companies only really care about this when it becomes a PR issue for them. Because it's not at the end of the day, if a company gets hacked, it's the customers that are losing out here. It's not the company. It's not the company. The company doesn't lose anything by having its customers' data breached. It's customers that are losing. So if we incentivize companies to, if we require companies by law to disclose when they've been breached, then customers can make a much more informed choice about whether they use the services of the company or not. And I think that's what we need to kind of encourage a more free market in terms of having security as a key feature in software that we all use and services that we all use. I mean, now that we all know that, for example, Yahoo has been breached and 3 billion accounts from Yahoo have been breached, and we didn't hear about it until 3 years later, you're probably thinking, I probably shouldn't use Yahoo to store sensitive information anymore. Probably gonna think twice about using Yahoo to store sensitive information, because you don't want that to be breached. And even if you might think, oh yeah, so what if some hacker somewhere has access to my information, to my emails or whatever? The problem is that a lot of this information often ends up being public. A lot of these databases often end up being released to the public because they might end up being sold on the dark web, but they often end up getting leaked. So there's people that I know, for example, that have a hobby of collecting as much leaked information about people as possible. So whenever there's a new leak, they find the information, they find the database for that leak, because sometimes in many cases, it's released publicly on Pastebin or whatever, or on dark web, and they just like build a massive database of all of these hacked credentials, and so that if they want to collect information about someone, they just type in your name or email address, and they find your information in all of these leaked databases that companies have been hacked from, and they can find things like all your passwords, all your addresses, messages that you've sent if they included in a leak, and so on, your phone number, and so on. And so often, they just like search for phone numbers of celebrities, and often you find phone numbers in celebrities in there that no one else has access to. If you want to find out if your information is in a leak somewhere, there's this really good website that you can use called haveibeenpwned.com. It's spelled haveibeenpwned.com. Pwned is spelled with Pwned, and you can just type in your email address in that website, and it will tell you whether your information has been found in any public breach so far. I can guarantee you, all of you will find your details there. If you have a LinkedIn account, then you will find your details there, because LinkedIn was breached in 2015. So if you had a LinkedIn account in 2015, then your password for LinkedIn is probably public right now, and you should not use the same password for LinkedIn anywhere else. And also, I think one key thing that we should look out for is cybersecurity insurance. Cybersecurity insurance could have a positive impact here, because TalkTalk is a good example. So TalkTalk, for example, TalkTalk was a company in the UK. It's an internet service provider in the UK that was breached last year 2 times, and 30 million users' accounts were compromised by a very simple vulnerability. It was basically SQL injection, and it was the person who did that was arrested, and it turned out to be a 15-year-old kid. And it always turns out to be like a 15-year-old kid that hacked this company for some reason. And I think that's if we can be hacked by 15-year-old kids, then we should kind of worry about these companies and the security practices. Um, and TalkTalk had cybersecurity insurance. They by some Swiss company, but actually, funnily enough, the way that they were breached was so basic that they were not actually eligible to gather any money from that cybersecurity insurance. They were not covered by that cybersecurity insurance because they were hacked in such a basic way that they were expected to cover. But the cybersecurity insurance paid damages of like 30 million pounds or something like that anyway, because they wanted to people to have confidence in the cybersecurity insurance industry. Because if they didn't pay out, other companies will look at that and say, well, what's the point of cybersecurity insurance if they're not going to pay out? But I think one of the interesting things about cybersecurity insurance is that your premiums will depend on how secure you are. So before a cybersecurity insurance company will give you cybersecurity insurance, they will decide how to charge you depending on how secure you are. So if they look at your security posture and they can see lots of basic vulnerabilities anywhere, your premiums will go up. So if your premiums will go up, then obviously you have an incentive to make your premiums go down and make your cybersecurity posture better, so that cybersecurity insurance companies can give you a better deal for that. And I think cybersecurity insurance will probably be like one of the things that customers will look out for in the future before going with a major company like an ISP like TalkTalk or BT or whatnot. I think in the future companies might actually say, well, if you get breached, we have cybersecurity insurance, so that we can cover any damages that you might get from credit card fraud or whatnot. So, does anyone have any questions? Do you have a question? You want to say anything?
Yes, I wanted to say that I also have a question for you.
Okay, what's your question?
Do you want to start with me?
Yeah, sure.
Okay, so your past is rather interesting. I'm a technology journalist, and I get to talk to people like you all the time. And I'm interested in knowing more about your OPSEC tips and tricks.
OPSEC.
OPSEC, yeah.
OPSEC for doing hacking, or like for preventing yourself from being hacked?
Well,
like,
let's start with the second one.
Okay. Well, I mean, I think in some ways, I guess like the OPSEC for doing hacking is similar to the OPSEC that you need for preventing hacking. Because like if you're doing hacking, if you're a hacker, and you want to hack into a company, and you work with other hackers to do that, you obviously want to be as anonymous as possible, and you want to make sure that any personal information about you isn't leaked or isn't compromised by anyone. So you don't want people to know your location or your real IP address or your name, for example. So you would obviously take measures to be as private as possible and to make sure there isn't public information about you or you can't be found on Facebook or whatnot. And I think in some ways it's actually very similar to what you should be doing if you don't want to be hacked, because the first step that hackers do to try and hack you is Google your company and find all your employees on LinkedIn and find out as much personal information as possible about your employees and about the CEOs as possible, to try to social engineer you, try to find information about you that could be used to compromise you. So you want to try to prevent, from an OPSEC perspective, how much information that could be used against you by hackers. How much information about the company can be found by hackers and be used against you. And in some ways that can be very hard to do, because obviously you can't tell your employees not to use LinkedIn or whatnot. And even the NSA has this problem, because if you look for NSA employees in LinkedIn, you'll actually find code names of top secret programs on their LinkedIn profile saying, oh yeah, I was involved in this top secret program that did XYZ, that did drone strikes or whatever. And they're not supposed to reveal that, it's supposed to be top secret, but they put it on the LinkedIn profile. But you should be instructing your employees to be careful about how much information they publicly put out on themselves, and it can be simple things like making sure that your Facebook default posting profile isn't share with the world, but share with your friends only. Simple things like that.
Thank you. Let's take the questions from the audience. Please state your name, title, and
Hey,
company.
I'm Cosmin from Mortec, and you talked about incentivizing companies. I would like to ask you, how do you feel about incentivizing black hat hackers?
Good question. I'm guessing you mean incentivizing black hat hackers to do the right thing. So that's so this is so bug bounties could be argued to be good for that. So for this if you don't know, a lot of companies nowadays have what they call a bug bounty program. So if you find a vulnerability or an exploit in Facebook or Google, for example, you can actually tell Google or Facebook, hey, I found this vulnerability in your systems, and they will pay you a few $1,000s, depending on how severe that vulnerability is, just for reporting that exploit. And as long as you don't use that exploit or vulnerability for bad things, and you don't sell it on dark web or whatsoever or whatnot. And I think that's a really good way to encourage people or to encourage like black hat or hackers that might stumble across a vulnerability in your systems to do the right thing. Now, I don't think it's a complete solution to getting rid of black hat hackers, because you can still make a lot more money by selling exploits to evil people than you can make by doing the right thing and reporting them to the companies. You can either, like for example, if you find an exploit in Chrome, you can either sell it to Google for like $25,000, or you can sell it to a company called Zerodium, yes, for $1 million, and they will sell that exploit on to like lots of evil people, like dictators in Egypt and whatever, and they're going to use that exploit in malware that they're going to use to put on activist computers and journalist computers that they're going to use to torture them. So it's this choice is, do you do the right thing? Would you do the right thing for $25,000, or would you do the wrong thing and potentially have people tortured for $1 million?
One more question, please.
Hi, Valentin, Orange Services. I have a question regarding China, and if you know, a few years ago there was a ban on the US market for Chinese vendors like Huawei, ZTE to work with the government
Yeah.
because of, how do you explain the UK government working with Chinese vendors?
Yeah, it's interesting. I mean, I don't know
No,
why
about nuclear, some nuclear plants, they were involved also there, so I think they're quite...
Yeah, I mean, I think it makes sense for the US not to instruct US companies to use Chinese vendors, because the US has so many exploits in software created by Chinese vendors and Chinese firewalls. If you look at the recent Shadow Brokers leak, they had so many exploits in firewalls created by Chinese companies. So it kind of makes sense that they would tell the US governments or public organizations not to use Chinese products, because otherwise they will be vulnerable as well. And obviously there's a lot of tension between the UK and the US and China. And I think it does make sense for the UK not to want to work with China on certain things, because GCHQ routinely exploits companies in China for espionage purposes to collect information about them. So it kind of makes sense, I think, from that perspective.
1 minute for one more question to the gentleman. Yes. Thank you.
Hello, my name is Sebastian Kirkheim from Jacobsdouw Egberts, and my question is if you are aware or you know about any kind... we are living in a world where we can see the big companies are hacked. NSA was hacked, yes, because the code for the ransomware was hacked and put public on the internet. So do you know any case where military service or army was hacked, and if not, why that was not hacked, and big company can implement some things what army are doing in order to protect better themselves?
Yeah. Actually, I'm pretty sure the US Army is even more vulnerable than most companies out there. Like the U.S. government is so the U.S. government is so bad at security that it's ridiculous. Like um, there was this hacker in the UK called Gary McKinnon, and in 2011 he hacked into NASA, and he found out that when he that what he the way he hacked into NASA was such a simple way. Like he hacked into NASA because they had open telnet ports with the username admin and no password. So you could literally telnet into NASA systems with no password and have access to all of their confidential documents. And there was actually, he found out there was actually like hundreds of hackers like on those systems logged in at the same time, like just like exploring NASA documents. And this is still the case today. So my friend Laurie Love, which is another hacker in the UK, he was accused of hacking into a whole bunch of US government institutions in 2013, like the US Federal Reserve and the US military and the Department of Defense. And they were also very simple vulnerabilities. Like the US government and the US military is still using Windows XP on many systems. So I don't think the US Army is much more secure. Like they have a lot of bureaucracy that prevents them from having secure systems. Because, and this was something that was brought up in the US Congress. The average time it takes for the US government to patch a security vulnerability is something like 60 days. And in many cases, they're still using Windows XP or outdated software because they have the resources to patch them. And in the UK, a lot of the NHS is still using Windows XP in a lot of cases. The UK government is still using Windows XP in a lot of cases, and they actually had to pay Microsoft £5 million just to extend the support contract because Windows XP was an end-of-life product.
Thank you very much for being here, Mustafa.
Thanks.